Greetings to everyone. We are having a special guest today. Our guest today is Polom Stabsom, sociologist living for 30 years in Zagreb, Croatia. His publications include books such as Social Policy and International Interventions in Southeast Europe, Towards Open Regionalism in Southeast Europe, Transformations in Global and Regional Policies, Making Policy Move Towards the Politics of Translation and Assemblage, and Social Inequalities and Discontent in Yugoslav Socialism. I will also introduce to you one of the interviewers today. It is Arturo Desimone. He is a Ruben Argentine writer, poet, and visual artist, but he has also published a number of interesting and well-written articles on politics that have previously appeared in Counterpunch, Democracia Abierta, Berfroa, UK, the M25 News, and elsewhere. So this is the short bio. My very short bio is I'm Aleksandar Novaković from Social Movement Flame. I am a writer and historian, and I would also like to add that this will be published on the channel of Social Movement Flame, which is a socialist organization, which has, I might add, none of connections with Socialist Party of Serbia or something like that, because we are European socialists, not socialists of Milosevic era. I might add that we fought against him, as we are fighting today against many other misdoings of the regime of Aleksandar Vučić. So we draw the line over there. And of course, I was ex-member of the M25. So without further ado, Arturo, let's start with first question for Paul.
Yes. Professor Stubbs, recently, I shouldn't call you Professor. Okay.
You can call me Paul.
Paul, all right. Recently, Croatia has entered the Eurozone and abandoned the precious kuna for the euro. And Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Union, celebrated this as a great victory for Europe, for Croatia. What can you tell us about this, the machinations here? What is driving, what is motivating this? Does this have something to do with Ukraine, with Europe wanting to show Russia that they will keep expanding? What is happening here?
Okay. So, I mean, the kuna was, as Alexander will well know, the kuna was, well, just accidentally, I guess, the name of the currency during the fascist puppet Ustaše regime in Croatia during the Second World War. And of course, part of the Croatian state building project has always been to kind of incorporate previous incarnations of Croatian statehood, yes? So I keep joking now that we've abandoned one fascist symbol, the kuna, and we've replaced it with another fascist symbol, the euro. Now, of course, I don't think it does have very much to do with Ukraine and Russia and the immediate geopolitics, because of course, since 2000, really, when briefly there was a centre-left government elected in Croatia, the narrative has been Euro-Atlantic integration, right? Now, some of us get very annoyed by the putting of the two things together, but they now seem, in the context of Ukraine, incredibly linked, right? So it's joining the European Union, but joining every aspect of the European Union. It would not be for Croatia to complain about the Eurozone, right? And the single currency. So Croatia signed up for the kind of, what were they, the 4 tests. And in 1st of January this year, they joined Schengen. So another kind of fascist club, another exclusive a zone of violence and exclusion. And they joined the Eurozone. And what is important, a friend and colleague of mine, Mislav Žitko, wrote a text about the euro currency for Jacobin. And the point that Mislav was making is really important, that it was presented as there is no alternative, including by the kind of left platform that I am nominally still a part of. Zagreb Naš is the municipal platform, and then Možemo, Yes We Can, is the national platform. So this...
Možemo is officially, Možemo is officially aligned to the M25, isn't it?
Oh God, no, probably. I mean,
well,
probably.
Zagreb Naš, if I may correct you,
Yeah.
Zagreb Naš is a member of it is attached with the M25 and also with Progressive International.
Yeah,
as well as Ne davimo Beograd, or let's not the Belgrade down. It's the same municipal organization. They're very much alike, these two organizations.
Yeah,
for our viewers who don't know what the M25 is, that's the Yanni Varoufakis movement.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I actually we'll bracket this off because that wasn't Arturo's question, but I'm much more interested in the municipalism of Zagreb Naš. I'm much more supportive of that than the national project of Možemo, right? But that's something we'll come back to. But isn't it interesting that, apart from the very left spectrum that would be opposed to the European Union in any case, the monetary joining the Eurozone was seen as absolutely a positive sign. Okay, people complaining about inflation and so on and so forth. Now, for me, I'm not sure that entry to the Eurozone was a massive deal because essentially for the last 20 years, Croatia's fiscal policy has been to keep the kuna stable against the euro. So, I mean, the idea that you give up your authority to the European Central Bank is something they'd already done some time ago.
If I may, how is it that the example of what happened to Greece, because Greece was not able to devalue its currency, whereas Bulgaria, Poland can pull off any sort of mischief and always devalue the currency, and life is livable there, and there's some room for autonomy for people to do things their own way. I mean, Greece is like so close by, it's in the Balkans. How is it that they didn't take any heed, any warning from that example since 2015 of what happens when you are a small, not rich, rather poorer country and you adopt the euro?
I mean, I think it's a really good question. And I mean, I think, Alexander will bear testament to the fact that across this whole region, the ability to remember certain things that happened many, many years ago and to forget certain things that are fairly recent, or to selectively remember and forget, is quite a big capacity, right? So, I suppose the fact is that 32 years of Croatian independence, there has only been 2 times to a total of 8 years when the ruling party has not been the kind of right-wing HDZ, right? And so the right-wing HDZ will be a combination of clientelistic capture, nationalism, but a kind of pro-European kind of, conservative, European conservatism. So you put the 3 together, and the argument, I think, would be that the Greeks were rightly punished for, trying to actually exercise autonomy over their policies. Let us not forget, we have probably the current Croatian Prime Minister, I mean, is desperate for a job in Brussels, because why should you be paid very little and have such a stressful job as Croatian Prime Minister, where you even get a tax from your own right wing, right? Wouldn't it be better to work in Brussels and have much less stress and a lot more salary? So he, I think it was very significant that Ursula von der Leyen and he took coffee in the center of Zagreb, that it was like very much, he talks about how he's always talking to Charles Michel on the telephone. So that kind of, the sycophantic relationship to Brussels is because sooner or later he would want to end up in Brussels. All right. I mean, my position on the European Union has hardened over time. And I think I did write something about the Greek crisis. And I think, you know, the fact that what you really have is an incredibly hardline EU, a fiscal waterboarding, Varoufakis called it. And I think that's what we see, really. You see very limited opportunities for spending that is on social welfare, education, health. Those are kept within strict limits. And the fiscal rules become the dominant form of the European Union. So, you know, is Croatia the periphery of the EU or the semi-periphery? I think as a Marxist, in terms of a kind of post-industrial state, you'd say it was the periphery. In a way that perhaps the Czech Republic is more semi-peripheral or even core these days. So the level of autonomy is limited, but the level of political opposition to the adoption of the euro was incredibly telling, it seems to me.
Okay, thank you. We were talking about the pretty much same situation. I see many parallels between Croatia and Serbia for various reasons. We are, as you know, both neighboring Slavic nations with common history, common cultural heritage and stuff like that. But there is one thing that is interesting, and that is that there was the only time when we had sort of more independent foreign policy in our histories. Both Croatia and Serbia and other ex-countries of Yugoslavia, it was the period between 1945 and 1990, actually, when Yugoslavia existed.
1948 and 1990.
1948, let's be more precise. Yeah, after that no to Stalin, of course. But, you know, we have developed as a socialist Yugoslavia, and we had more space to maneuver, in international politics to do something as Yugoslavia, as united front of small Slavic nations on the Balkans than we do today. So we were part of non-aligned the movement, and I would like to ask you: is there any possibility? Yeah, of course, that's one of the reasons why we asked you here for the in the first place. But I wanted to ask you: is there any chance for this movement to revive? Is there any chance for a revival of non-aligned movement?
That leaders of Asian and African peoples can meet together in their own countries to discuss and deliberate upon matters of common concern. In spite of diversity that exists among its participants, let this conference be a great success.
The delegates assembled in the conference hall decided that in the present situation they should give their immediate attention to the following questions: the general situation in the world, the establishment and strengthening of international peace.
Revive. Is there any chance for a revival of non-aligned movement?
So let me actually do the prelude to this, because I think you're absolutely right, and that's why I am obsessed with Socialist Yugoslavia and the non-aligned movement. That actually, through a very, you know, the break with Stalin in 1948, right? The anti-fascist tradition that resonated with decolonial movements in the global south, the failure of the Balkan Federation to really work for political reasons, meant that actually, you know, probably from even the mid-50s, but certainly institutionally from 1961, Yugoslavia was incredibly important in global politics because it was kind of a soft leader of the non-aligned movement, right? And of course, non-aligned movement also had India and Egypt and some big countries. But, you know, Yugoslavia, for its size, had an immensely bigger impact and importance in global politics, both at the very top level in terms of Cold War East-West and kind of global North-South relations, but also because lots of Yugoslavs worked in the UN agencies. They were involved in kind of UN.
We were in the peacekeeping troops of UN, of course, everywhere.
Yeah. But you know they were important in terms of social rights, economic rights, new international economic order, a whole lot of things, right? Now, can that be repeated? Well, Aleksandar Vučić in Serbia only remembers the non-aligned movement every 10 years when there is a 50th anniversary of the Belgrade summit in 2011, or as there was in 2021, the 60th anniversary, right? Lavrov was invited, Russia was a guest. I think they were selling arms in the room next door, it was extraordinary. So you've got, and I have written about this for the Progressive International, you've got the answer to your question, I really haven't forgotten, is that there is no relevance of the actual non-aligned movement today, right? The non-aligned movement today still meets, it articulates some things, but nobody listens, right? It often ends up with lots of arguments between the member states of the non-aligned, right? Which actually Tito worked very hard to make not part of the conferences in the 60s and 70s. Okay.
Well, so there's
the actual. Yeah, sorry. Just let me one more sentence, because the actual non-aligned movement is irrelevant, but the spirit of non-alignment is much more important than it ever was. Right.
Right.
And I suppose the thing I often say to liberals, and thank goodness there are no liberals here, but the kind of, when we're supposed to condemn the Russian invasion, as I do, but we're not supposed to mention NATO because NATO is irrelevant to this. I actually say, why do you think it is that so many countries in the global south abstain on UN resolutions condemning the Russian invasion? And the reason, of course, is because they see this as not part of their politics, which is about global inequality and the importance of, 40, 50 years after the end of colonialism. I suppose the French colonialism is still with us, yes, but let's think about the Portuguese Revolution and the independence of Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Cape Verde. Almost 50 years after that, neo-colonial economics are still around, right? So the spirit of non-alignment, which would be about self-determination, the rights of nation states to determine their own social systems, it would be about complete disarmament. It would be about global economic justice. Those things, the spirit of non-alignment, are more important than ever. Now, non-alignment is not neutrality. Non-alignment is a much more positive spirit, right? And maybe today we need to think about non-alignment through social movement, through social forces, and so on and so forth. And yet we now see, is it Finland, certainly, probably Sweden as well, want to join NATO. So the fact that this spirit of non-alignment cannot be an important force acting in world politics is a real problem, because we need it more than ever.
Yeah, I just might add that Finland and Sweden and Austria were not members of non-aligned movement. No. But they were always present at they were always present at the conferences of non-aligned.
They had observer status, and for a while in the UN, the neutral and the non-aligned were quite closely together. There was a neutral and non-aligned group, and I've been doing a lot of research. I'm still doing it now. That's why I'm in London, on the new international economic order, and actually the Swedes and the Dutch were actually much more supportive of the demands of the global south than, of course, the UK or the US. So
the Dutch have changed enormously. The Netherlands was very vocal in supporting the ANC at the end of apartheid. Back then, we remembered their relationship to the Moors.
Ireland was very supportive in the 70s. But the new international economic order ended with global neoliberalism, with Thatcher, Reagan rolling back at home and rolling out neoliberalism everywhere. Now, of course, the global south already had, you're in Argentina, right? So the structural adjustment, that began in Latin America and Africa, Aleksandar will know, moved to Yugoslavia already in the 80s. So,
the President Alberto Fernandez, has disappointed huge numbers of people, especially the youth, because they thought he'd bring back this attitude of intransigence of the Nestor Kirchner and Cristina Kirchner era, when there was UNASUR, which was a construct that Chavez made. I'm not sure Chavez knew about the non-aligned movement, but UNASUR combines Venezuela with...
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and I think that may be that would be, sorry, so we're jumping in on each other, but I think perhaps if there isn't the possibility of a big non-aligned movement, what there could be are regional progressive blocs, right? And so the Bolivian, Venezuelan, Argentina, Chile, that kind of idea, that if you could find in Latin America 4 or 5 leftist-led governments, then regional cooperation could happen,
And if I may jump to a question we were planning for later, but I think it makes sense to ask it now. So the Greek politician, academic Yanis Varoufakis, recently he released something called the Athens Declaration, alongside a Turkish writer, and Jeremy Corbyn also went there. It was about 2 paragraphs with a few sentences derivative from the M25's foreign policy papers. And they announced an Athens Declaration that the title was "We Need a New Non-Aligned Movement," and it's about 2 paragraphs. So are you aware of this, and what do you think of this as a beginning?
Yes. So Yanis, if you're watching, look, I mean, DM25 in its initial iteration was incredibly Eurocentric. But I think it's really important that the leadership in DM, the key figures, they probably would not call themselves leaders, although they are, the key figures actually listen to that critique. And I think now, the fact that DM25, Progressive International, they were recently in Cuba, because Cuba is the new president of the G77, and they kind of had this double kind of platform. One is, as you say, the Athens Declaration, the need for a new non-aligned movement. The other is the need for a new international economic order. And the old new international economic order, which I'm doing a lot of work on now, was incredibly interesting in terms of, the idea that neo-colonial economic domination, the power of multinational corporations, had to be kind of shrunk, and we needed terms of trade for the peripheral countries in the global south to have consistent better prices for commodities, stable and good prices. We needed a level playing field in global economics, right? So I think these 2 combinations, the non-aligned idea and the new international economic order, which really came from the non-aligned movement, G77 and UNCTAD, right, in the 70s. The Algerians were also pushing it quite a lot. Those 2 ideas intellectually work. For me, they're incredibly important. The problem I have, and I don't think that the people putting these forward have not thought about this. The problem I have is one of which social forces globally will take these things forward. Because, I was going to quote Marx, and the phrase has gone out of my head, but, the materiality of ideas ideas are great, but if they don't have a material force behind them, they don't become the ruling ideas, right?
Was it up until now philosophers have interpreted
there's that one, but there's another one as well. But yeah, I mean, anyway,
the German ideology. It's from the German ideology.
Yeah, we could end up with 20 minutes on the right Marx phrase, but the point would be that ideas are just free floating unless they have powerful social forces behind them.
Absolutely.
And I do worry that actually, okay, throughout the non-aligned movement history in the 60s and 70s particularly, you have Cuba on one side, perhaps too radical. You have Yugoslavia on the other, too conservative. Actually, conservative as in not wanting to kind of, not wanting to muddy the waters, not wanting to muddy the waters too much, but wanting to have influence with both of the power blocks. So if, as Progressive International is doing, you tie these things to the Cuban presidency of the G77, I mean, okay, Cuba's now different. Cuba is, could potentially now be a kind of important figure in a new left realignment, I suppose. So I started off being critical, but I think I'm moving to an idea that maybe it's not such a bad thing. But new non-alignment, new international economic order. But you can read the new international economic order, and Samir Amin brilliantly said, why do they never use the word capitalism about what it is they're criticizing? And there was
the European Green New Deal and other texts of the M25, if you search in the PDF for the word class, it might appear twice.
Yeah. And there's a problem there, right? I mean, okay, we know why it's difficult to bring class and capitalism in, but if you don't, then where are you really going with this? There was genuinely, among some of the people in the new international economic order, the idea that the whole world could agree to this because everyone would win. And of course, that's not how we see the world, right? In terms of class struggles. Samir Amin, again, was brilliant. He kind of said, I think this is about the bourgeoisies of the global south trying to get a bit of the piece of global capitalism for themselves. And I very much like Vijay Prashad's work, where in a sense you need that double movement, right? Decolonial states became subjects because the national bourgeoisie worked with the national popular forces. But then the national popular forces needed to destroy the bourgeoisie, frankly, or, take power over the bourgeoisie. And that never happened.
This idea of remembering Bretton Woods is not new in Argentina or in Latin America. And these neo-Keynesian ideas, I'm not necessarily against them, but they're not very new. They are basically what the economists who were in the Lula, Kirchner, Correa governments were advocating. And I'd like to see Mexico more back on the map of the global left. Very few people talk about Obrador in Mexico.
I agree. And Mexico was probably, along with Algeria, one of the key proponents of the new of a more radical version of the new international economic order. No, I mean, I'm not. I mean, I think the point is that this Keynesianism can also have a quite left variant, right? Which might not be too bad, but it's still capitalism with a human face, right? It's still kind of, private modes of production, but redistributory welfare state. And that may be the best we can hope for. I mean, I think isn't that the whole point of political struggles? They're always about the possible and the utopian, but you need to have both in your mind at some point, because if you only look at the possible, then you're actually constrained by the rules of global capitalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I would ask you, talking about the capitalism, let's go back to Socialist Yugoslavia. You have described the period, especially from 1961 to 1990, the period in Yugoslav history, as period of Yugocentrism. Can you explain to us the meaning of that term? And I might say that there is a fair description of Yugoslavia in this period, and that Yugoslavia was basically helping the global South countries, sometimes even with weapons, like in the case of Algerian uprising against the French occupation.
Absolutely.
So
the Angolan, yeah.
Yugoslavia was everywhere in the global South.
But let's do Yugocentrism is a bit more. I mean, it's one of those things where, you know, when you edit a book, the book takes a long time to come out, and then something that was meant as a kind of auto-critique of the book comes out before the book comes out. So the text I wrote on Yugocentrism was really more about a kind of research agenda, right? It was more about saying it's fine to talk about the non-aligned movement using Yugoslavia as the key case study, Yugoslav archives as the main source. But if we're going to go much further with this, we need to decenter Yugoslavia, right? We need more research from other places and about other places. So that was that. But of course, Yugocentrism can also work because, as I said earlier, Yugoslavia, Socialist Yugoslavia, had an influence within the non-aligned movement and in the world much bigger than its size, right? And then we have to ask that question about what was Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was incredibly, for me, contradictory. I still think Igor Stix once called it the most successful socialist experiment of the 20th century, which, if you think that 1917 was the 20th century, right? That's quite a bold claim. But I also agree with like Darko Suvin, who talks about 20 glorious years of Yugoslavia, right? Ending around 65 to 68, because then, I often say this, Yugoslavia did experiment with market socialism, but originally it was more socialist than market. But between 65 and 68, the kind of reforms made it more market than socialist, right?
Right.
So it became, now I had a conversation with Joanna Bockman yesterday, who wrote this wonderful book about how come in Yugoslavia and Hungary there were all these economists in formerly socialist countries influenced by neoclassical economics, right? So this is a much more complicated story. Not all markets are capitalist markets, right? And self-management was, I think, a really important participatory mechanism originally for factories, but then spread to the community. However, you do end up with a revolution that runs out of energy. It becomes bureaucratic, technical, managerial. It becomes marketized. Later, it becomes a lot of competing nationalisms. And of course, because of the second oil crisis, Yugoslavia, I think, was destroyed by the second oil crisis, when oil-producing members of the non-aligned movement did not give them cheap credit. So, Aleksandar, the IMF came to Yugoslavia already in the early 80s, right?
Actually, it was 1 year before Tito's death. So it was about 1979. Yeah. We were already facing big national debt. It was like about $20 billion, which was a pretty hefty sum back in the days.
We don't need to talk to an Argentinian about national debt, right?
Yeah.
You know about this, but absolutely at that moment, Tito had the hope that the newly oil-rich states would actually put money back into kind of supporting the non-oil producing.
Well, as Mark Twain said, history don't repeat, but it rhymes. And like what we saw, the breakdown of the Latin Americans populist governments that were at first so defiant, but they all went to hell. That had something to do with an oil crisis as well. The price of oil became cheap. I don't know if it was the Libyan war, if it was fracking, if it was Saudi Arabia deciding to overproduce the barrel upon some command from Washington. But suddenly, towards the end of the second Obama administration, the price of oil went down. It created an oil crisis affecting Venezuela, which could no longer deal with the sanctions, affecting Argentina, affecting Russia. So maybe that's like a repeat of what happened then.
No, absolutely. And that's why I think, that period that starts with the Lusaka summit in 1970, goes through the new international economic order, but it ends with the second oil crisis, is a really important moment in global history because it ends in it ends in the absolute victory of neoliberalism rolling out throughout the world. But it didn't need to be like that. And what's really important is the first oil crisis, the G77 maintained a huge amount of unity, probably very much thanks to the Mexicans and the Algerians at the time, actually, because the argument was, well, if you can do it for oil, you can do it for copper, you can do it for coffee, you can do it for tin, you can do it for aluminium, and so on and so forth. The second oil crisis really kind of fragments that unity. And of course, you have the United States determined to smash the power of the G77. Later, they leave UNESCO, which is kind of it seems a trivial thing, but it's not. And they basically say global economic governance is the World Bank and the IMF. The UN is a flawed institution because, my God, all of these newly decolonial states have an equal vote to our vote.
Yeah. When we were talking about the oil crisis, I might say that it was a strange situation. Back in 1970s, late 1970s, Yugoslavs were watching UK being hit by huge economical crisis.
Yeah.
And we were watching that UK had power cuts and strikes everywhere and racial tensions, stuff like that, and Thatcher coming to power. And then 3 or 4 years later, we had power cuts, food rations, we had big national debt, and we basically were out of business. Basically, many people started leaving the Yugoslavia after Tito's death. So basically, we were facing the same situation as UK was facing 3 or 4 years ago. It is an interesting parallel, although UK was and is capitalist country and Yugoslavia was socialist, but IMF controlled us all.
Absolutely. I'm even old enough to remember when the Labour Chancellor was on a plane and the IMF forced him to come back to talk to the IMF in London, So this is a really complicated story, but to be Yugocentric again for a moment, I think, the economic crisis was huge, right? But Alexander, you would agree that Yugoslavia was also destroyed by a political crisis. And that political crisis was, in fact, the creation of a technocratic kind of political elite. And there were lots of strikes, right? I mean, you can do the graph of labor unrest in Yugoslavia, and it rises in 75, 76. But the voice of organized labor does not get heard by the kind of League of Communists of Yugoslavia, and it certainly doesn't get heard after Tito dies. So that one might see Gilas as a kind of bit of a weird liberal anarchist, but Gilas is his idea that you need to renew revolutions, right? You can't just let them solidify into bureaucratic, technocratic autarky. You need new faces, and the new faces were Milosevic. What was Milosevic's history? He was a banker in Washington for Yugo Bank.
Yeah, Absolutely. But you know, when we're talking about this, I will remind everyone about student demonstrations in Belgrade back in 1968. You know what was the biggest slogan of the demonstrations?
Free love.
Down with the red bourgeoisie in 1968. Dole crvena buržoazija.
Yeah.
This has a very strong parallel to Latin America, where people talk about the Boli burguesia in Venezuela and how things became very bureaucratic and static, especially after the death of Chavez.
Yeah.
Can we
the
switch
same
to
thing, you know, 23 years after the partisan struggle, actually Tito was heading a kind of table of leading figures, and no one else had fought in the partisans. You know, they'd all been purged or died.
Yeah, or retired. Yeah,
or retired, as Kocha Popović did, retired.
Kocha Popović, yeah.
When he saw the way things were moving.
Yeah, Kocha Popović was a Yugoslav foreign minister and one of the most brilliant, both military tacticians, intellectuals, and the foreign minister of Yugoslavia and representative in United Nations for quite a long time. A remarkable person. Basically.
Brilliant guy.
Yeah.
I mean, I tell people that I started this work on history 6 years ago when I thought Kardelja was great and Kocha Popović not so great. And over 6 years, I've completely changed my view of the two of them.
Yeah.
And Popović was fascinating, of course, because he would when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs, he would try, you know, he would get diplomats to say things in the first 10 minutes and not stay for an hour and say the same thing 6 times, which is what I might end up doing in this podcast. But anyway.
But speaking of which, Arturo has the next question. So,
well, we're curious as to the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. This is a very, very historically specific question. I know very little about it other than Sukarno was an economic nationalist in power at the time, and that this had. How does this compare to the first non-aligned movement summit in Belgrade in the 60s?
That's such a good question to ask a sociologist who has now become the history nerd in a way. And you know, perhaps I didn't push the book enough because the book is not authored by me. I only edited it. There are like 14 chapters. And actually, one of the disagreements in the book, I mean, I love the fact that authors in the book disagree with each other, right? I wanted to promote that. But one of the disagreements is actually the relationship between Bandung in 55 and Belgrade in 61, right? And too often you actually see what I'm going to call sloppy scholarship. So I turn out to be a leftist, but also an academic snob, right? But the sloppy scholarship kind of says, you know, the non-aligned movement started in Bandung in 1955 and then was institutionalized in Belgrade in 1961. It's not true. They are two separate processes. The Bandung Conference was the Afro-Asian Conference of 1955, right? Now, crucially, Sukarno was involved, but crucially, Zhou Enlai of China and Nehru of India, right? Now, Nehru had been articulating this kind of, he didn't call it non-alignment, but a kind of peaceful coexistence kind of model. But what they decided to do at Bandung was invite every African and Asian state. Now, there was a lovely speech, I think it was Sukarno, because basically he said, I recognize many of the people around this table from the 1927 Congress in Brussels against colonialism, right? Since then, many of you have been imprisoned, But now we don't have to meet in Brussels. Now we can meet in Bandung. This is our moment. This is our moment in history, right? Now, it involved some socialist, quite pro-Soviet states. It involved a lot of pro-American states. But it passed some resolutions. The only reason it never continued, Arturo, was because India and China had a huge border dispute. Now, you couldn't have a Bandung 2 without both of them, right? Because they're incredibly big. And into that kind of vacuum, so Yugoslavia was not invited to Bandung. Tito's wife's biography contains a bit where she pretends they were in Bandung and that she overheard Tito and Nehru talking to each other, and she said, why don't you do something instead of just talking? Yugoslavia was not a Bandung.
Is it very fragrant, full of aromas and jacaranda plants?
Yes, maybe smoking too much. Yeah, I mean, so look, that meant that Afro-Asian unity could not continue. So you end up with non-alignment. Now, one argument would be that the non-aligned movement was very different because it was a universal process. I'm not convinced about that. You didn't really get a lot of Latin American countries, partly because Cuba was involved from the start, partly then later because of the kind of, that moment of leftism, the Allende, the overthrow of Allende, the coup in Chile, kind of.
Plan Condor.
Yeah. So where am I going here with this? Just that probably with Bandung is incredibly important. And the Bandung spirit, just like the non-aligned spirit, kind of fit together, I think, really.
Sure.
Sorry, just two more things, because I think these are also really important. Sorry, this is very nerdy. One is that in 1965, the Tricontinental was held in Havana. And the Tricontinental was incredibly important because it tried to say, let's bring three continents, Latin America, Africa, Asia, together. So it was almost like an updated Bandung with Latin America. But they also had, like, the Black Panthers came from the United States. People have written about this. It kind of deterritorialized the anti-colonial struggle. The idea that there were Souths in the North. To be black in inner city New York is like to be
the third world.
South. Yeah.
Back then, the black liberation movements looked outwards towards the third world movement, the anti-colonial movement, whereas today the Black Lives Matter mainstream tells the rest of the world what to learn about race and conflict. Yeah,
I mean, I think that you're onto something there. I wouldn't put it quite so strongly for a variety of my own emotional, intellectual reasons. But I actually think this forgetting of what I've called circuits of decolonial affinity. Yes. When Lumumba was assassinated, students protested in Belgrade, including, of course, African students, but also local students. So, that idea of anti-colonial solidarity, which I suppose the only recent thing, the World Social Forum, that kind of, or the protests against the G7, those kinds of things.
The Portuguese sociologist who I believe founded or co-founded that was recently in Argentina speaking.
Boa
yes.
de Sousa Santos, yes.
Yes, I saw him in the Centro Cultural Kirchner speaking.
Excuse me, Paul. You have when we're talking about non-aligned movement, and there was always one picture that was very popular, and it is also between us, Balkan leftists, very popular these days. It is almost a meme. It is a combination of two photographs. On one photograph, you see Belgrade, 1961. Yugoslav students talking with fellow African students. They're dressed nicely, reading newspapers. The other photograph is Brussels, 1961. White woman from Belgium giving candy. to a girl, and that girl is African girl placed in the human zoo in the center of Brussels. So they treat them like animals. We treat them like brothers and sisters and comrades. So we always had that big pride of Yugoslavia because we were the only Europeans who didn't come to colonize, but to help and to build. We always had a big pride about that.
I think that's really important. Just today, I went to an exhibition run by two friends of mine, Bojana Piškur and Angelina Radaković in London. But there's a film made by Nika Autor on the building of the Šabac-Sarajevo Railway line in 1947, right? So people came, Arturo, from all over the world. Young people came from all over the world, and within 7 months, they had built from nothing in the most crazy terrain, like rocks, hills. They had built a railway that I think was like 240 kilometers from Šabac to Sarajevo. The film said people from 52, young people from 52 countries came. And the film is framed because, although we don't know who she is, there was a Palestinian woman, a young Palestinian young woman, as part of those international brigades rebuilding Yugoslavia after the war, building railway lines. So, Alexander, it's even 1947, you know, people from all over the world are coming to build socialism in Yugoslavia. And in 1961, Belgium, one of the most brutal colonial powers, says the man from Britain, we probably, you know, the competition as who was the most brutal was pretty fierce, right? And we were all
in Liverpool.
But you know, that moment. Now, I do have something I haven't written yet, which is a bit of a critique of some of the anti-racism of the Yugoslav politics within the non-aligned movement, and this might separate us out as different kinds of leftists, because for me, racial capitalism is a structure. You know, race is not an identity. Okay, it can be a political identity, but it is a structure. So colonialism and capitalism are interlocking, or imperialism and capitalism are interlocking structures. I actually think that the Yugoslavs, you know, wanted to condemn rightly apartheid in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, but they didn't see it as a global system of racial capitalism.
I get it. But you know, I was actually, the thing that I said before was actually just an introduction for the key question, and the key question is if you take a look at non-aligned movement, it is pretty colorful bunch, isn't it? Like you have republics, socialist republics, or liberal capitalist republics. You have monarchies, even theocracies, and some of them are prone more to West, and some are more prone to Warsaw Pact. So basically, how can you explain what was the glue that kept together all those very different countries on 3-4 continents?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, you've got an issue here that the more the non-aligned movement expanded in terms of member states, the more difficult it was to keep that consensus. But I actually think that, you know, the consensus in the 1960s was, even those states like Ghana that were actually quite interested in working closely with the Soviet Union, they actually said, but we didn't stop being a colony so we can be a neo-colony of you, right? There's an amazing moment. You know, Tito finally understood Stalin when they met in Moscow, and I guess after several vodkas, Stalin got his notepad out, and Tito wanted to talk about, you know, grassroots democracy, women's rights. And Stalin said, so do you have copper? How much copper do you have? Do you have aluminium? You know, this was a classic colonial extractivist idea.
There's a famous moment when Guevara in Cuba was worried about too much Soviet influence, even though that was a very different Soviet period, a much more liberal period, I think, the Soviet Union, at least until Khrushchev was taken out of the picture. And he was actually telling an envoy of Kennedy's that we would rather have good relations with you. You are nearer by us. We would like to have peaceful and normalized relations. That's exactly the moment when Kennedy's advisor flew back and said, attack them, bomb them immediately. You know,
yeah. So absolutely, that moment of political, we don't want to be part of either of the two blocs. We also don't want to be blown up we don't want to be caught in a nuclear war that we have no stake in, actually. And then, of course, in the 70s, we want our ability to be economically self-reliant. We don't want to, you know.
Recently, I heard a commentator who's actually rather right-wing, Sagar from the show Breaking Points, say that people who believe that, like Hillary talked about somehow removing Putin so that somebody gentler will replace him, and this new right commentator, he said she knows nothing about the pattern of history because Nikita Khrushchev actually may have been taken out of the picture in the Soviet Union precisely because he backed down with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He softened there.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for us to imagine how close to nuclear annihilation the 60s was, yes, and I do think there's another issue here about, you know, and I had this conversation earlier today, actually, or yesterday. You know, I actually think self-management, the system of workers' self-management, and later, as I said, community self-management, was such a great system that actually the Yugoslavs should have been kind of promoting it a bit more in the non-aligned movement, right? They didn't try and sell it in a way, but partly they didn't sell it because they didn't want to appear to be offering kind of hegemonic solutions, right? And there's a famous, and I wish I could remember the exact context of this, but one of the countries where both the Yugoslavs and the Soviets sent military advisors, it may have been Ghana, but I may have got this completely wrong. But the person basically said, look, the Soviets either tell us what to do or get drunk and don't bother, whereas the Yugoslavs actually listen to what we want. What are our aims? What do we want to do? Now, the reverse of that is that, of course, Sukarno is overthrown by Suharto, probably one of the most savage fascist coups of the 20th century, and the Yugoslavs rightly don't meet with the new Indonesian authorities for quite a while. But when they do, they say, I hope our arms deals are still intact.
Yes.
You know, so the search for new markets, what am I saying here? Of course, there was solidarity, but you also wanted new markets.
Suharto's coup was exactly around the same time in a very similar modus operandi as Videla in Argentina.
Yes.
I mean, Suharto killed many more people in a more populous country, but the way of shock, torture, and who they replaced, Perón, Sukarno, it's all, you know, these are totally different cultures, but it's a very, very similar chain of events that took place. And the regime here kept maintain its weapons and other exchange with the Soviets. And I don't know what the relation was with Yugoslavia at the time exactly.
Relationship of whom with Yugoslavia? Indonesia or
Argentina?
Well, Yugoslavia and Argentina had very strained relations since 1945. And the obvious reason was that many criminals coming from different military organizations, such as a smaller number of Chetniks, left for Argentina to Buenos Aires and other cities, and we wanted them extradited, and the Argentinian government kept them. And we also wanted some Nazis who...
You're breaking up, Sasha.
But
But Peron had a good relationship of some sort with the non-aligned movement. I mean, it's a similar.
No, absolutely. Argentina was an observer. Sasha's right that basically the problem of emigres and political diaspora was really, really important. But actually, Argentina was quite an important kind of sympathizer of the non-aligned movement, really.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about workers' self-government and many other social measures, did Yugoslavia also influence, in a way, British politics? I know that Tito and Anjurin Bevan had good relations and many other people from Labour Party, actually. So,
yeah, no, I mean, I was just I'm in London because I want to go and look at the archives, right? And yes, I mean, I think that kind of Labour, Tito had a good relationship with Churchill, but then, the immediate, we're back to Keynesianism and the welfare state. But I mean, 1945 in the UK was not a revolution, but it was a social, it was a dramatic social reform. And there was a great deal of interest in the left wing of the Labour Party and the left wing of the trade union movement with Yugoslavia. But I would say actually the two countries that were most interested in self-management were Algeria and Sweden. Sweden, were wanting to think through participatory democracy in the workplace, and they sent people to look at what was going on in Yugoslavia. The Algeria-Yugoslav story is a complicated one because Tito identified with Ben Bella, who was overthrown by Boumediene. But actually, a lot of the autogestion in Algeria happened. You also, of course, have the French and Italian communist parties incredibly interested in self-management at some moment.
Yeah. So, well, in Southern America, there are cooperativas. They have certain similarities.
Yeah, and it would have been, I mean, I actually think one of my, this is with the hindsight of history, if only the Yugoslav, don't get me started on praxis intellectuals, right? So you've got that the praxis group of kind of dissident philosophers who only read German social theory, right? They were not reading Fanon. They were not reading Pan-African writers. They were not reading Senghor. If only there'd been a more self-reflexive idea of Yugoslavia to talk to cooperatives in Latin America more, to kind of connect with, what Paulo Freire was doing in Brazil, or in other parts of the world. There wasn't quite enough of that kind of, what I would actually say is more non-alignment from below, a focus on community groups and participatory struggles, grassroots struggles.
Thank you. This is great answer. I would like to ask Arturo for the next question. I think that we can hear each other. Arturo?
Yes. Well, I just spontaneously just occurred to me. I spent a while, a certain amount of time in a small country, Tunisia, which was influential recently with the unfortunately misnamed Arab Spring, but which also had, under the progressive regime of Habib Bourguiba, had a certain role in the non-aligned movement that was quite significant. And I wonder if you see any. I mean, it's a small country, yet it was somehow very not as small as Yugoslavia. I mean, smaller than Yugoslavia, obviously, but it had a certain influence, and it's had a certain repercussion again 10 years ago, at least in the world. And
yeah, no, I actually think the small countries thing is really important. I'll preface this with half a joke. I mean, Tito and Nero did not get on very well. Partly Tito thought Nero was far too kind to the British because he'd been educated in the UK. But Nero didn't just get annoyed that Tito had stolen his idea, but Tito would frequently talk about the non-aligned movement as empowering small countries. Now, whatever else you might think about India, it's not a small country. But you can certainly see it with Tunisia. You can also see it with some of the Caribbean states. So Jamaica under Malcolm Manley, Guyana with LFS Burnham. And this brings us back to that question you raised around Bolivia, Venezuela. You know, the Caribbean was also at the time trying to think about what a Caribbean progressive federation might look like. You know, the idea that there could be Caribbean unity rather than a whole lot of small islands, each going separate
with
ways.
direct lines to England, to the former colonizing country.
Yeah, indeed.
And of course, inevitably, we're almost compelled to bring up Ukraine. Looking at Ukraine and thinking of the non-aligned movement, on the one hand, I think it's very sad how much of the world, the African countries that would have quite easily sympathized if the Ukrainians are alienated from them. Because the Ukrainians, they are clearly very poor and exploited comparably to the West. But they, with the way that their cause is sold to Africa, Anthony Blinken went around bludgeoning and trying to more or less bully the African countries to further deprive and further incommode their populations by not doing any trade with that's convenient to them with Russia. How is on the one hand, that kills what would have been a very easy solidarity, I think, given that Ukraine was an invaded country, a country that's mostly poor people and resource rich. How is, Stalin a century ago, the way he absorbed Ukraine, which Ukraine had a certain kind of socialist in the autonomy, and it was and Lenin found that very important because he saw something in the character of Ukraine as a very special, character that needed to be, that he wanted Ukraine to have that autonomy. Stalin put an end to that. Was that example an example that may have motivated figures like Tito to have a non-aligned movement in the first place, this historic example of Ukraine?
Gosh, I think that's very interesting. Look, this would need another podcast about the relationship between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, right? Tito, of course. Let us not forget, Tito was in Leningrad, St. Petersburg when the revolution happened. Tito took part in the Russian Revolution. All right. He was imprisoned by the Tsar. So he always hoped, and I think Khrushchev really was his hope. He always hoped that there would be more of an understanding of the importance of what was the phrase, diverse roads to socialism, right? But he absolutely saw Soviet minority policy as something to be avoided at all costs, right? So, we could say the four pillars of Yugoslav socialism were, of course, anti-fascism, self-management, non-alignment, but also brotherhood and unity. This idea that you would actually not suppress national feeling necessarily. You would not suppress national identities, but you would never let one national identity rule the others, right? Now, this was a very complicated juggling act, which you know, has to be understood across different time frames. But Arturo, the way you introduce this is exactly the kind of discussions we need to have on the left, which does not start with kind of a liberal refusal to look at NATO, and on the other hand, a left-wing refusal to kind of see this outside of a kind of weird imperialist struggle. This is global, but it's global in a very different way from previous conjunctures. So two things are important here, I think. Yes, there should have been the possibility of a solidarity between a neo-colonial invasion and countries in the global south. Didn't happen for two reasons. Do you remember the way in which black students from the global south who couldn't even get into Poland because, you know, the Polish border guards could hardly believe that there were multinational students in Ukraine studying, right? Which would have been totally normal during the non-aligned movement and was totally normal during the Soviet Union. So that kind of racism was really, really important. But the other thing, of course, is that Ukraine's struggle, of course, is militarized, and that's a legitimate struggle against the invasion, right? But it's militarized in a proxy war, in a kind of let's spend as much money as possible on giving the Ukrainian government what they need to fight, you know. What am I saying with this? And the whole point of that is that that's an incredibly costly enterprise, right? So instead of trying to think about solutions that involve less military spending, we are forced into only thinking about more military spending. But it does raise, so the final point here, I think you're absolutely right, the kind of, and I tried to explain this the other day, that can we think about nation states and self-determination in ways that do not make us fetishists of Westphalia and the idea of a European nation state? Because for me, once you do the whole world, what is nation and what is a state are certainly not the same thing, right? But they also need to be thought through in terms of what are the levels of social organization that matter, and what are the kinds of autonomy. And, you know, where Aleksandar lives, there's, you know, well, because of the nature of the politics, it's very difficult to find a solution to Kosovo, the Kosovo question, right? Mm-hmm. But the idea of how you could have folded autonomy or, you know, sovereignty, self-determination in a way that doesn't reproduce nationalist and neoliberal forms seems to me to be where we need to start thinking on the left. And it sounds a bit utopian because I don't have any great ideas about this, other than maybe it wouldn't be bad if the United States and the Soviet and the Russian Federation would actually go to the UN for mandates rather than when the UN says no to something, they just invade anyway.
Well, that brings us to something important: the weakness of the UN, because the UN today is a sprawling. It's the largest organization in the world, and it's the most disappointing. It was shocking. Its inaction during Syria was shocking. Its inaction and its failure today. The non-aligned movement, though, I think that the times when the UN was the most impressive, when its rulings were the most interesting and daring, like when it supported Amilcar Cabral, that kind of coincided with the heights of the non-aligned movement, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I always quote Amil Cabral in 1964 in the Cairo summit said, "The United Nations is a giant with its hands tied behind its back." And every demand, probably one of the most important demands of the non-aligned movement, was let the UN do what it was supposed to, what it said on the tin it was going to do, right? That it was going to be a global forum for global governance. Now, you know, that could be global bourgeoisies, but the demands were pretty simple. No more vetoes in the Security Council. How did that happen, right? And, you know, it happened because you would not have got the United States, the Soviet Union, and later China to agree to even have a UN if they didn't have veto powers. But veto power in the UN should be gone. There should be more equality in UN bodies. Actually, the World Bank and the IMF should no longer be separate. They should really be part of the UN, and they should not have voting based on how rich countries are, right? So basically the United States controls the IMF. The head of the World Bank is always from the United States, but so is the head of UNICEF. You know, these countries traditionally have managed to kind of completely subvert the UN. And that's why, you know, the 60s and 70s are fascinating, because you have UNCTAD, which is really the creation. UNCTAD creates the G77, but the G77 also creates UNCTAD. UNCTAD becomes a place in which left-wing economists can actually think of a world in which terms of trade are not colonial. And it was never implemented, of course, but many parts of it, you know, did influence. And we need a strong UN today, right? We do not need the World Bank and the IMF. We do not need the World Trade Organization, and we don't need vetoes in the Security Council.
So would you say basically that the lesson of all this history is that we need movements for UN reform?
Yeah, but equally, I think, and this is linking back to my previous point, which was a bit vague, but maybe is important here, and it's not about NGOs, because look, NGOs can be the liberal underclass of, you know, liberal capitalists, the kind of lumpen proletariat of liberal capitalist hegemony, right? It's not about NGOs and projects, but this idea of a kind of a forum in which every nation state is equal, but also in which there is the possibility of critique from below, critique from popular movements, some kind of dynamism of the two would be incredibly important and interesting. And again, I think we only find that now in regional, you know, the Bolivarian, the thing you talked about earlier, you know, the kind of Latin America alliances. You could do it maybe when you've got more cultural linguistic similarities, but you can also do it if you actually break down global hegemony.
Speaking of which, what about the Progressive or Socialist International? Is there any possibility? Do you see any political possibility of its creation? Because, for example,
they have good graphic design.
You know, you're talking about progressives. You have Progressive International, and it is basically centered around M25 and other smaller organizations, and it is not, well, it doesn't have real political power. What I'm asking is basically, do we have the possibility? Is there any political possibility of creation of such an organization to cover the whole of the world?
So we've been going almost an hour and a half, and I've managed not to kind of. No, I almost at one point thought I was going to be guilty of what you might call identity politics, But my big fear here, there is a time when those of us from the north and the west of the world need to be a bit more humble and need to listen and not speak. Now, that doesn't mean we have to be silent necessarily, but it means that we need to spend time in humble listening to forces and voices that are not from the territories we're from. So I'm saying this as a Brit to an Argentinian and a Serbian. So it's only me, actually. It's only me. But the danger of Progressive International is that it's still Bernie Sanders, Yanis Varoufakis. You do get the voices from the global south, but it's not. How am I going to, there are people that could be the new, this is going to sound pathetic actually, but the new Nkrumah, the new Nyerere, the new Castro, there is an important point about listening to voices from the global south.
I agree, and when I recently looked at the website of Corbyn's Peace and Justice project, and I also saw immediately the large portrait of Varoufakis immediately underneath the logo. So it's the same people all the time. And if I look at the PI, I do find that it does have certain high-profile Western academics.
Yes.
Usually at the center, and usually seeking to associate themselves with high-profile people.
And can I just add that, and maybe this is perhaps too much, but we haven't really talked about gender very much in this. And for me, gender, race, class are interwoven structures of exploitation and oppression. And my fear of some of the kind of new internationalism these days is that it actually might be Western arrogance combined with a kind of global machismo, in which we celebrate Che Guevara, the revolutionary figure who is undoubtedly male, probably heterosexual, if not homophobic. And we celebrate that kind of military, the military moment of decolonial struggles. Now, those decolonial struggles, women fought alongside men, right? In the Cuban Revolution, in the Algerian Revolution, in the Yugoslav partisans, right?
Of course.
So this is really, really important to think through a kind of a global internationalism. And I was not really a part of the World Social Forum, but I miss it. And I think the World Social Forum had a degree of reflexivity about some of these things. Okay, I think people got very frustrated that you could never discuss anything because you would be so wrapped up in who was saying things. There's a real danger in that. But we have to have in our DNA as leftists, I think, this kind of interwoven
I think
class anti-colonialism.
I think to have that, we need to listen also to the leftist self-criticism that's come from Cuba and Nicaragua.
Yes.
And we don't have that. Either you're pro-Ortega or pro-regime change.
Yes.
And there's very little internal self-criticism.
Yeah.
Many people also regret what happened in Cuba, the persecution of artists and homosexuals for 5 years. If the quinquenio gris, the 5 gray years. It's also interesting to see how Cuba dealt with that.
Yes. And I think you were described in the introduction. This is the first time we've met, but as an artist. I mean, I do think cultural workers are often the most important people who articulate the critique of a kind of dominant kind of unspoken ideology, even on the left. So even progressive forces need that constant critique, right? They need the constantly bringing back to like how we relate to each other as human beings, I think. And you know, I think Boa de Sousa Santos, that kind of decolonial approach is very conscious of this. I once actually, Alexander, you will know the book by Todor Kulic on the memories of the left, but I actually love the book. But I was part of a discussion about the book, and I said, you know, we need reflexive ambivalence. Some of us need not just to be more humble, but we need to be much more ambivalent, not so certain anymore. And his response was correct, of course, that ambivalence isn't a great political program, right? And ambivalence is the space that artists and intellectuals can occupy, but I actually think it's an important space.
Yeah, we need to have at least some ambivalence in certain situations, of course.
When we were in the foreign policy group of
also our policies and our ideology and stuff like that, but we need to take a look at us from the guy's perspective, or take the other guy's shoes, of course.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, there is that. So without further ado, I think that that pretty much wraps it up for tonight, and I think both of you agree. So once again, I would like to say thanks again, big time, for the great conversation, for Polom Stabsom. Thank you for being with us, and I hope we will see each other soon, virtually or otherwise, because we are on the same peninsula.
Yeah, I've never been to Argentina, so I would love to meet up with you, Arturo, but I will in about 3 weeks be in Belgrade.
Wow.
Yeah, it will be great. So see you over there. Arturo, Paul, warm regards. Be good, stay good, and I will send you the recording afterwards. So see ya.
Thanks very much, and
Bye-bye.
let's hope the people we criticize won't be watching this.
I hope so. I hope so. And I hope to see you all in Belgrade one day.
Yeah, likewise. See ya. Bye bye.
Ciao.
Sloboda narodu.